They filled it on a Tuesday. 200 feet of irrigation channel, my grandfather cut by hand in the fall of 1951. 18 inches deep, 12 inches wide, stone-lined, gravity-fed from a spring creek that ran through our property before anyone in the county had a zip code. 75 years of water, flowing from creek to garden, without a pump, without a motor, without a single day of interruption. The HOA filled it with dirt and gravel in 6 hours. They called it an unauthorized water diversion from a community creek. The creek ran through my grandfather's land, 20 years before the community had a name. But here's what they never checked. A water appropriation entry in the county water ledger, filed in September 1951. My grandfather's name. The county water clerk's signature. One sentence that said this channel was approved before the HOA, the subdivision, or any of those houses existed. That entry cost them $280,000. Now, and this is important, I want you to hold one detail in your head the entire time I tell this story. An entry, written by hand, in a county water ledger in 1951. Not a deed, not a permit. A water appropriation record, the kind of document that says who has the right to use the water on their own land. I'll tell you exactly what that entry said, and why it destroyed the HOA's entire case before this video is over. Didn't see that coming? Subscribe now, because these stories only get worse. But first, you need to understand what that channel meant to us. My grandfather understood water the way most people understand money. You don't waste it, you don't take it for granted, and you never, ever depend on someone else to give it to you. He bought 10 acres outside of Winslow in the spring of 1951. The property had a spring-fed creek running along the west edge, cold, clear, steady year-round. The garden plot was on the east side of the lot, 200 feet from the creek, on a south-facing slope with the best soil on the property. The garden had water. The creek had water. There were 200 feet of dry ground in between. So he dug. He started in September, after the harvest. A pick, a mattock, and a flat-blade shovel. He cut the channel 18 inches deep, 12 inches wide, running from a diversion point on the creek to the upper edge of the garden. 200 feet in a straight line, dropping 1 inch for every 10 feet of run. Just enough slope for gravity to do the work. He lined the bottom and sides with flat creek stone, fitted tight, to keep the clay from silting in. He built a simple gate valve at the diversion point from scrap pipe and a wooden handle. Open the valve, water flows. Close it, water stops. No pump, no electricity, no moving parts except the handle. The first time he opened the valve, the water took 11 minutes to travel from creek to garden. He timed it with his watch. Cold, clear water, running through a hand-cut channel at the speed of patience. My grandmother planted the first vegetable garden that same fall. Tomatoes, peppers, snap beans, squash. The water from the channel fed them all. By the following summer, she was canning more than the family could eat, and giving the surplus to neighbors who drove out from town every Saturday. My father grew up with the sound of that water. It was the first thing you heard in the morning. My grandfather opened the valve at 6 a.m., and the sound of water touching stone was the signal that the day had started. It ran until evening, every day, spring through fall. The garden never wanted for water, and my father never knew what a dry season felt like until he went to college and learned that other people had them. He took over the garden in 1986. Same channel, same valve, same 6 a.m. He expanded the plot, added fruit trees along the south edge, peaches and apples. The channel fed them too. He ran a farm stand at the end of the driveway every August and made enough to cover the property taxes. I grew up with that sound too. Every summer visit, the first thing I noticed pulling into the driveway was the water. You could hear it from the car, A low, steady murmur, like the land was breathing. I made boats from oak leaves and raced them down the channel with my sister. The water was so cold your feet went numb if you stood in it for more than a minute. Nobody complained. The channel sat behind the garden, invisible from the road, feeding a garden that had been producing food for 75 years. Then Brookhaven Estates went up across the creek. The subdivision was built in 2023. 48 homes on a former timber tract west of the creek. The developer cleared the trees, graded the lots, and paved roads. Every house had municipal water, a sprinkler system, and an HOA dues statement of $375 a month. 6 months after the first closings, homeowners started noticing that the creek level was lower than the sales brochure had promised. Creekside living was losing its creek. Backyards that were supposed to border a flowing stream were looking at exposed mud and slow water. Nobody blamed the developer who had removed 30 acres of tree canopy and replaced it with impervious surface, increasing runoff and reducing groundwater recharge. Nobody blamed the 48 sprinkler systems pulling from the municipal supply that drew from the same aquifer the creek was fed by. They blamed my father's channel. The HOA's watershed management officer was a woman named Leah Thornburg, early 50s, environmental consulting background, the kind of person who used the word riparian the way a carpenter uses a hammer, at everything, whether it needed it or not. She had lived in Brookhaven Estates for 11 months. Leah's first act was to commission a watershed impact assessment from a company called Blue Ridge Hydro. Blue Ridge Hydro also held the HOA's stormwater maintenance contract. The assessment identified a private irrigation diversion on the adjacent property as a contributing factor in reduced creek flow volume. A contributing factor. My father's channel used approximately 8 gallons per minute during garden season. The 48 sprinkler systems in Brookhaven used a combined estimated 600 gallons per minute at peak. But the report identified my father's 75-year-old gravity-fed channel as the problem. The notice arrived in April. Notice of watershed non-compliance. Adjacent Lot 11. An unauthorized water diversion has been identified, drawing from the community creek without HOA watershed authorization. Property owner must cease diversion and decommission channel within 45 days. Community creek. My family's creek. On my family's land. Flowing through property my grandfather bought in 1951. 22 years before the developer's parents moved to the county. My father called Leah. He was patient. He explained the channel had been there for 75 years, that the creek was on his property, that he was not a member of the HOA, that his water use was a fraction of the subdivision's. Leah said she appreciated the context. She said the HOA's watershed management plan designated all sections of the creek within the Brookhaven watershed zone as community water resources. She said the zone included my father's property. My father asked when his property had become part of the Brookhaven watershed zone. Leah said the zone was established when the HOA adopted its management plan. He asked if anyone had asked his permission to include his property. She said property-level consent was not required for watershed designation. Not required. They drew a line on a map, put his land inside it, and told him his own water was now theirs. The first fine arrived on day 46, $400 per week. Unauthorized water diversion from community watershed. My father didn't pay. He drove to the HOA office with a folder, the deed showing the creek on his property, tax records showing the garden as an agricultural use since 1951, photographs of the channel, the stone lining, the gate valve, the water flowing clear. Leah looked at the folder. She said the issue wasn't ownership of the creek. It was net watershed impact. She said my father's diversion was reducing available flow for community riparian habitat. Community riparian habitat. The creek had been running through his property for 75 years before there was a community. The habitat was his first. The second fine was $800 per week. The letter added a new violation: unauthorized modification of natural waterway contributing to downstream ecological degradation. The channel didn't modify the creek. It diverted 8 gallons per minute through a gate valve that could be closed at any time. The creek's total flow was approximately 200 gallons per minute. My father's channel used 4%, and they called it ecological degradation. The third letter arrived 3 weeks later. Notice of watershed remediation. The Brookhaven Estates HOA board has authorized the closure and filling of the unauthorized irrigation diversion on Lot 11. Remediation will be conducted by Blue Ridge Hydro. Method: earth and gravel fill. Estimated cost to property owner: $8,400. Same company that wrote the assessment. Same company that identified the problem. Same company now being paid to fill a channel they'd never tested, on property they'd never surveyed, carrying water they had no jurisdiction over. My father called me on a Saturday evening. His voice was tired. Not angry. Tired. He said, "They're coming for the channel. Tuesday." I said I'd handle it. I said I'd be there Monday. I wasn't. The crew arrived Tuesday at 7 a.m. 2 dump trucks, one with fill dirt, one with gravel. A small excavator for spreading. They started at the garden end and worked toward the creek, filling the channel in sections. Dirt first, then a gravel cap, tamped flat. 200 feet, 75 years of stone-lined channel, filled in 6 hours. My father was home. He heard the trucks. He walked to the back of the lot and watched them fill the last 30 feet, the section closest to the creek, where the gate valve sat on the diversion point his grandfather had built. They buried the valve under 2 feet of gravel. The last thing to disappear was the wooden handle. My father watched it go under. The next morning, my father walked to the garden at 6 a.m., same as every morning for 40 years. He reached for the valve handle. His hand closed on air. The handle was under gravel. The channel was under dirt. The connection between creek and garden, between water and soil, between his father's engineering and his family's food, it was gone. He stood there. He said later, the silence was the worst part. For 40 years, 6 a.m. meant the sound of water touching stone. That morning, 6 a.m. meant nothing. Just his hand in the air where the handle used to be, and quiet where water used to run. Day 1. The garden looked the same. Day 3. The tomato leaves began to curl at the edges, subtle. You'd miss it if you weren't looking. Day 5. The soil cracked. Hairline fractures running between the rows. The clay contracting as the moisture that had been constant for 75 years evaporated into July air. Day 7. The first tomato dropped. Not ripe. Green and hard. It fell because the vine couldn't hold it anymore. Couldn't hold anything anymore. My father picked it up from the cracked dirt and held it in his palm. A tomato that would have been ready in 3 weeks if it had had water. He didn't say anything. He set it on the porch railing and went inside. I arrived that Friday. The garden was dying in slow motion. Leaves curled and gray. Stems bending. Fruit dropping. The peach trees along the south edge had leaves the color of old newspaper. 200 feet of filled channel ran through the property like a scar. A line of dirt and gravel where a line of water used to be. I looked at the garden. I looked at my father. I called an attorney named James Hargrove. James specialized in water rights, agricultural use, riparian disputes, prior appropriation claims. 19 years of practice, most of it in the western half of the state, where water law is older than most of the towns. I told him everything: the channel, the creek, the watershed zone, the assessment, the fill, the garden dying by the day. James asked one question. Did your grandfather file a water appropriation when he built the channel? I didn't know. My father didn't know. James said that in 1951, the county required a water appropriation filing for any diversion from a natural waterway for domestic or agricultural use. If my grandfather filed, there would be an entry in the county water ledger, the official record of water rights for the county. He drove to the county water board office the following Monday. The water ledger from the 1950s was in the archive. A bound ledger, leather cover, handwritten entries, organized by year and lot number. The kind of book that doesn't get opened often because nobody remembers it's there. James found the 1951 section. He turned to the entries for September, page 87. Third entry from the top, written in dark brown ink in a careful, upright hand by a county water clerk named Floyd Amos. Sept 22, 1951. Lot 11, Winslow District. Private irrigation channel. Gravity-fed diversion from Spring Creek for domestic agricultural use. Channel length 200 feet. Stone-lined. Gate-controlled. Water volume. Approx 8 gal minutes seasonal. Classification. Domestic agricultural appropriation. Approved. F. Approved. September 22, 1951. 8 gallons per minute. Domestic agricultural use. Filed with the county. Entered in the water ledger. Signed by the water clerk. My grandfather had walked into the county water board office before he opened the valve for the first time. He'd filled out the appropriation form. He'd described the channel. Length, width, lining, flow rate. He'd waited for approval. He'd done it because he knew that as Winslow grew, someone might look at his creek and decide they had a claim to it. He was right. He was just 75 years early. James read the entry twice. Then he closed the ledger slowly, the way you close something that matters. This is a prior appropriation, he said. In water law, there's a principle that governs everything. First in time, first in right. The person who appropriated the water first has the strongest claim. Your grandfather filed this appropriation in 1951. The HOA was established in 2023. He was first, by 75 years. They didn't just fill an irrigation channel. They destroyed a county-approved water appropriation on private land without checking the water ledger. This isn't a watershed dispute. This is a water rights violation. You'd think, at this point, the HOA would send a crew to dig the channel out. You'd think. Leah Thornburg received the demand letter on a Wednesday. By Thursday, she had emailed the board arguing that the water ledger was a historical document with no bearing on current watershed management, and that prior appropriation does not apply to HOA-designated watershed zones. James anticipated this. He'd already obtained a certified statement from the county water board confirming that all entries in the county water ledger remain active and legally binding records of water appropriation rights, unless formally revoked by court order. No entry for Lot 11 had ever been revoked. Certificate of Appropriation 51-0087 was active, valid, and in force. He'd also retained an independent hydrologist who examined the creek. The hydrologist's report confirmed that the creek's reduced flow was attributable to 3 factors: removal of 30 acres of tree canopy during development, increased impervious surface area from roads and rooftops, and municipal water system drawdown from the shared aquifer. My father's channel, diverting 4% of total flow, was not a measurable contributor to reduced creek volume. The HOA's own watershed problem was caused by the HOA's own subdivision. My father's channel had nothing to do with it. James filed the lawsuit Friday morning. Trespass. Destruction of a county-approved water appropriation. Violation of prior appropriation rights. Unauthorized action on private waterway. destruction of agricultural infrastructure, crop loss, intentional infliction of emotional distress. He named the HOA, the board, Leah Thornburg, individually, and Blue Ridge Hydro. He noted the conflict of interest. Blue Ridge had authored the assessment and was then paid to perform the remediation. He attached the certified water ledger entry as Exhibit A, enlarged to 200%, Floyd Amos's careful handwriting, legible on every line. The hydrologist's report as Exhibit B, the deed showing the creek on my father's property as Exhibit C. The HOA's attorney reviewed the entry, the hydrologist's report, and the deed. He called Leah and told her two things. First, the appropriation was valid. Second, the Brookhaven watershed zone had no legal authority over a prior appropriation filed 75 years before the zone was invented. Leah argued that watershed management superseded individual water rights. The attorney told her it did not. He told her that in water law, prior appropriation is the foundational principle, and that no private association can override a county-filed water right by drawing a line on a map. She demanded the board fight. The vote was 4-1 to settle. Leah was the one. The case settled in 8 weeks. The HOA paid $280,000. That covered the full excavation and restoration of the irrigation channel. 200 feet of fill dirt and gravel removed, stone lining cleaned and reset, gate valve rebuilt and reinstalled. It covered the crop and garden loss, 3 months of production during peak growing season, including the fruit trees that had to be supplementally watered by tanker truck to keep them alive. It covered legal fees, emotional distress, and a penalty for destroying a county-approved water appropriation without verifying the water ledger. The $8,400 remediation invoice was voided. Blue Ridge Hydro was terminated as both the watershed consultant and stormwater contractor. A state water board investigation was opened into whether Blue Ridge had knowingly misattributed creek flow reduction to a 4% private diversion while ignoring the 96% impact of the development they serviced. Leah Thornburg was removed from the watershed management position and resigned from the board. 3 other board members resigned within the month. The Brookhaven watershed management plan was permanently revoked. The watershed zone, that included my father's property, was dissolved. An independent study confirmed what the hydrologist had found. The creek's reduced flow was caused by the development, not the channel. The developer was required to fund a watershed restoration project. They planted 1,200 trees along the creek corridor to restore the canopy they'd removed. The creek level began to recover within a year. The channel was restored that fall. A crew excavated the fill-in sections, cleaned each stone my grandfather had set, and relaid them in the same positions. The gate valve was rebuilt, new pipe, new handle. The same design, same function. Open the valve, water flows. Close it, water stops. My father tested it on a Tuesday morning, 6 a.m. He walked to the diversion point, put his hand on the new handle, and turned it 90 degrees clockwise. The click was the same, and then the sound came. Water touching stone. The first rush of cold through 200 feet of hand-cut channel. The sound his father had heard the first time he opened the valve in 1951. The sound my father had heard every morning for 40 years. The sound I had heard every summer, pulling into the driveway, before I even turned off the engine. It took 11 minutes for the water to reach the garden. The same 11 minutes it had taken 75 years ago. My father stood at the garden end and watched the water arrive. It spread into the irrigation furrows between the rows, cold, clear, steady. The cracked soil darkened. The dry clay softened. You could almost hear the ground drinking. He replanted the following week. New tomatoes, new peppers, new beans. The peach trees had survived. The apples had survived. The channel was feeding them again. On the wall of the garden shed, Next to the valve handle, he framed something behind glass. A certified photograph of page 87 of the county water ledger. Floyd Amos's careful handwriting. September 22, 1951. Private irrigation channel. Domestic agricultural use. Approved. My grandfather filed that entry the same month he opened the valve for the first time. He could have just dug the channel and used the water. Nobody would have known. Nobody would have cared. But he walked into the county water board office, described his channel down to the gallon, and waited for the word, approved, because he knew that water was too important to use without permission. And he knew that someday, someone would look at his creek and call it theirs. First in time, first in right. He was first, by 75 years. 75 years, one water entry. His channel still runs, and some fights aren't about the channel. They're about making sure the woman with the watershed plan never gets to decide who owns the water on land she doesn't own. If you made it to the end, you already know you belong here. Subscribe, because next week's story makes this one look like a sprinkler dispute.